My name is Clara Vance, and I am 34 years old. 3 weeks ago, I sat in the absolute last row at my only sister's wedding because my parents had informed me in writing that they didn't want me ruining the photographs. My sister was marrying the man who had been my fiancé. My parents bankrolled the entire spectacle, the white hydrangeas, the historic estate, the high-end drone hovering above the chapel steeple like a patient hawk. 200 guests watched Gemma glide down the aisle, and not a single one of them noticed the plain manila envelope resting inside my handbag 15 rows back. What I did during the vows made every person in that chapel forget how to breathe. My mother still hasn't forgiven me. She likely never will. But the envelope comes later. First, you need to understand what my family taught me about portraits, because everything that unfolded in that chapel began with a photograph taken 22 years ago. Welcome back to their secret stories, where hidden truths are brought into the light and quiet women finally stop staying silent. If you've ever been the one your family kept just outside the frame, this story is for you. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from today. And be sure to subscribe. I've been a senior legal assistant at Sterling and Cole for 11 years. It's a 2-partner firm on Main Street in Oak Ridge, Oregon, population 8,500 and change. I live alone in a rented apartment on Cedar Lane with a drip machine that runs on spite. My job is details, deadlines, public filings, certified copies, the boring paper skeleton that keeps other people's lives from collapsing. I'm good at it, and I come by it honestly. My grandmother, Martha Finch, spent 30 years as an archives clerk in the county records office. When I was 7, she taught me to spell by quizzing me on the names of Oregon rivers. When I was 17, she taught me the only rule she ever held sacred. Words fade, Clara. Documents endure. She said it the way other grandmothers say grace. Grandma Martha passed away 2 years ago at 85 in her sleep, which was the only gentle thing that year offered us. She left behind a modest mountain cabin on Mirror Lake and a trust fund she'd built out of 3 decades of county paychecks, about $220,000 for each granddaughter. My sister Gemma and me, to be distributed when we married or turned 35, whichever came first. The cabin went to us jointly, half mine, half Gemma's, every cedar plank and every squeaking screen door. My mother referred to the trust as Martha's little hobby. My father simply signed his name where the estate attorney pointed. I called it what it was, the only inheritance in our family that came with love instead of conditions. Grandma Martha left us one more thing she never wrote down. It took a wedding, a long-distance phone call from a stranger, and one manila envelope for me to truly understand what it was. Here is the photograph you need to see. Autumn. The year I turned 12. My mother, Evelyn Vance, ran a boutique pastry shop back then, and she curated our family the same way she styled her window displays. Everything was angled toward the street. That fall, she hired a professional photographer for the annual family portrait. I had fresh braces, a clumsy cast on my arm, and a home-cut set of bangs my mother called tragic. Gemma was 9, fresh off winning Miss Cascade Jubilee, all ringlets and dimples. The photographer took one look at the 4 of us, and my mother took one look at me. Then she smiled and said we'd do 2 versions, just in case. The card that went out to 300 families that winter showed my mother, my father, and Gemma in matching cream knit sweaters. 3 people. My mother framed it and hung it over the fireplace, where it remained for 22 years. When I asked about it once at 13, my voice shaking, she straightened the frame and said the sentence that heated our home like a furnace. Family is a portrait, darling. My father, Richard, said nothing. He adjusted the picture wire so the frame wouldn't catch a glare. That was Dad. A carpenter who could repair any structure in the house except what was broken inside it. And here is the part I need you to understand, because it took me 2 decades to see it. I wasn't angry back then. I decided that the portrait people needed a crew, and I would be that crew. I held the light reflectors. I steamed the sweaters. I believed that being useful behind the camera was its own kind of being loved. That belief cost me more than any man ever did. You'll see exactly what it cost by the end of this story. Julian Hayes arrived in Oak Ridge 3 years ago. 30, 5 years old, a regional representative for a high-end medical device company. The job kept him on the road 4 days a week, which I'd later learn was the entire point of the career. He looked like a model on page 12 of a department store catalog. Perfect teeth, a firm handshake, shirt sleeves rolled up to exactly the right height. He memorized every local business owner's name in a month. He cleared the sawdust filters in my father's workshop without being asked, and he courted me like a man who had studied for the exam. Which, as it turns out, he had. He brought custom roasts to the law firm on Thursdays, black, single origin. The way I take it, a detail he noted on our very first date and never once forgot. My mother posted a photo of us on social media. It was the first time in my life I'd been the daughter worth sharing. We got engaged a 1.5 years before the wedding this story is about. He proposed at the lakeside cabin at sunset, and I said yes with my whole, careful heart. 2 things happened that spring that I filed away in my mind without realizing I was archiving them. First, Julian asked a lot of questions about Grandma Martha's trust. How the funds were released, who managed the account. Just curious about the tax implications? Babe. Second, I asked him to sign a standard prenuptial agreement. I'm a legal assistant. I've watched marriages dissolve on my desk like wet paper. For me, it was routine procedure, not an accusation, Julian said. Of course, no problem. Whatever makes you feel secure. But his smile paused for 1 split second, like a video buffering, looking back. That single second was the only genuine thing Julian Hayes ever showed me. 14 months before the wedding, on an ordinary Tuesday, I drove up to the Mirror Lake cabin with a stack of dry rot inspection reports. The deck needed structural work. The contractor needed signatures, and I handled the tedious task because that was my role in this family. I wasn't expected. That detail matters. Julian's Jeep sat in the gravel driveway, and my first thought, I want you to understand how innocent it was that he'd driven up to measure the deck posts for me. The screen door was unlocked. I stepped into my grandmother's living room, and I heard my sister laugh upstairs. That specific, rehearsed laugh she saved for public gatherings. And then I heard Julian's voice answer her, low, in a register I recognized. I stood completely still in the house where Grandma Martha taught me to play gin rummy. On the windowsill where she used to keep a bowl of lemon drops sat 2 crystal glasses, one stained with my sister's coral lipstick. I didn't go upstairs. I didn't scream either. People always ask about that. I'm a legal assistant. I don't scream, I inventory. 2 vehicles in the driveway. 2 glasses on the sill. 1 engagement ring on my left hand, 4 months old. I took the spare cabin key off my keyring, set it on Grandma Martha's kitchen table where they couldn't miss it, and walked back to my car on legs that felt like they belonged to a stranger. Then I sat behind the wheel and watched the water ripple beautifully for a while, because the lake didn't know any better. On the drive back to town, my phone began vibrating against the passenger seat over and over, like something trapped in a box. I assumed it was Julian choosing his words. It wasn't. It was my mother. And what she said when I finally answered told me everything about the next 14 months. My mother didn't ask if I was okay. I need you to sit with that. Gemma had already called her crying, getting her narrative established first. A skill my sister had practiced since grade school. Mom's voice came through the lines smooth and sweet. These things happen, Clara. You were always so consumed by your work at the firm anyway. Gemma needs this happiness. Don't make it ugly. Just like that, my engagement was treated like a scheduling conflict. I asked her. Calmly, I'm told I am always calm, whether she understood that her younger daughter had been seeing my fiancé. She sighed the way she did at a ruined batch of pastries and said, The heart has its own reasons, Clara. My father got on the line for a brief moment, cleared his throat, and asked if I'd slept. That was his entire speech. That was the maximum protest Richard Vance could muster. Within a month, Julian and Gemma were public. The town whispered for exactly 2 weeks, because that's how long it took my mother to work the local social circles. By Easter, the narrative around Oak Ridge was airtight. The engagement had simply faded over time. Poor Clara was married to her career, and really, Julian and Gemma were just one of those matches meant to be. She told the local charity committee that I had given the couple my full blessing. I found that out at the grocery store from a woman who patted my arm and called me incredibly gracious. So, the woman whose ring got recycled became the bitter sister, and the new couple got a sweeping romance. That is what my mother could do with a narrative and a Sunday brunch. Here is the question I carried with me all year, the one I would answer at a church altar in front of 200 people. What do you owe the truth when the people you love only love the picture? Keep that question in your pocket. We'll need it. 8 months before the wedding, Julian proposed to my sister with a large solitaire diamond at an orchard, with a professional photographer hired in advance. Of course, there was a photographer. The engagement announcement ran in the Oak Ridge Herald with a half-page photo. Julian and Gemma on the dock of my grandmother's cabin, golden hour light, his hand resting on the small of her back. My mother shared it to the town community page she managed, and it traveled the way small town news travels, which is to say, instantly and forever. Then Mom did something that told me exactly how much this wedding meant to her. And I mean that financially. She put a massive portion of her retirement savings into the budget. The riverfront estate for the reception, 200 guests, a photographer imported from Seattle, and a drone operator because apparently the skies needed a copy of the event, too. People called it the grandest wedding Oak Ridge had ever seen, and my mother repeated the phrase like a mantra. Around that time, Gemma sent me a text message for the first time in a year. No apology, no acknowledgement of the past, just this. Since you never used the Mirror Lake cabin, would you be open to selling me your half? Julian says it's much smarter for tax purposes. I stared at that message for a long time, not at the request itself, but at how the second sentence began. Julian says, I typed back one short line, the politest refusal I had, and began paying attention in a completely new way. Over the next few months, every plan that came out of my sister's mouth arrived wearing that exact same uniform. Julian says joint accounts are much simpler. Julian says the trust fund should be actively working for us. Julian says, I started counting how many of my sister's sentences began that way. I stopped counting at 30, because by then, I had started doing something far more useful. I started listening like a legal assistant. The invitation arrived on heavy cream cardstock, addressed in elegant calligraphy, with a smaller note tucked inside in my mother's own handwriting. We'd love to have you there, Clara. Just keep a quiet presence for everyone's sake. I set it on my kitchen counter and looked at it for 3 days, the way you look at a bill you cannot dispute. And then, alone in my apartment on Cedar Lane, I decided exactly how this would go. I would attend my sister's wedding. I would wear dark gray, sit where they placed me, greet my extended family, and smile for 0 photographs. And then, once the cake was cut and the drone had landed, I would quietly remove myself from the Vance family orbit. No dramatic scene, no long letters, no forwarding address for the holidays. You cannot fire your family, but you can stop showing up for the job. That was the entire plan. Dignity, then distance. I want that on the record because of what people in this town said about me afterward. That I'd spent months plotting. That I arrived at that chapel looking for vengeance. No, 3 weeks before the wedding. I had nothing in my handbag but breath mints and a quiet resignation I hadn't spoken out loud. Then, on a slow Tuesday afternoon, the indicator light for line 2 started blinking at the office. Our receptionist was away at lunch. I picked up the line the way I've done 10,000 times before. Sterling and Cole, this is Clara. A woman's voice came through from somewhere in Washington. Tired in a way I recognized when looking in the mirror. She said, "I'm calling about a man named Julian Hayes. I believe he is getting married in your town. He cannot. Because he is still married to me." Her name was Audrey Fletcher, and she was calling from Spokane, Washington, 3 hours east of my desk. She told her story plainly, the way exhausted people do. She had married Julian 9 years ago. They had a son, Liam, who was 7 now, when Liam was 2. Julian left for a medical sales convention in Seattle and simply never came back. No note, no divorce filing, no forwarding address. She couldn't afford an attorney to track down and divorce a man she couldn't locate. The years went by. Then, 2 weeks prior, a cousin had sent her a screenshot from a public social media group, an engagement announcement. Golden hour, a lakeside dock. A man's hand on a bride-to-be's back. My mother's proudest post, traveling further than she ever dreamed. Audrey had spent those 2 weeks gathering the courage to call a law firm in the groom's new town, and she happened to get me on the phone. Now, here is the thing about my training. I wanted to believe her instantly, and that is precisely why I didn't let myself. Wanting to believe is how people get fooled. She could have been an ex with a grudge. It could have been a different Julian Hayes. You would be amazed how many people share the same name. So, I did what I was trained to do. I opened an intake form and recorded everything full legal names. Date of marriage, the county that issued the license, the last known address she had for him, and the name of the medical supply company he worked for back then. Everything matched. My pen kept moving, while my stomach dropped floor by floor, like a malfunctioning elevator. Before she hung up, Audrey said something I've thought about every single day since. "I don't want him back, Clara. I just want a valid address to serve him." That night, I sat at my kitchen table and typed a formal records request to Spokane County, Washington. Grandma Martha used to say that words fade, but documents endure. We were about to find out. Quick pause. If your family has ever asked you to stay quiet just to keep the picture looking perfect, tell me about it in the comments. And subscribe to their secret stories. Because what came back in the mail is something you'll want to hear. If you've never worked with public records, here is the part nobody tells you: marriage records are public information. Anyone, you, me, a tired mother from Spokane, can request a certified copy of anyone's marriage certificate from the county that issued it. It costs about the price of a takeout dinner. There is no national database that automatically catches a man who marries in Washington and then applies for a license in Oregon. The system relies entirely on the honesty of the person filling out the paperwork. So during my lunch breaks that week, I worked the problem like a case file. I requested a certified copy of the marriage record for Julian Michael Fletcher and Audrey Ann Ruiz, Spokane County, 9 years back. Then I searched the divorce dockets for Spokane County and the surrounding areas for every year since their wedding. Nothing. No dissolution. No annulment. No legal separation. I paid for an official clerk's letter confirming the search had come up completely empty, because a missing record only holds weight when an official states it is missing. And while I was digging through those dockets, I found a bonus, a civil default judgment against Julian M. Fletcher, 5 years old, for $45,000. It was money he had drained from accounts he shared with Audrey's family hardware business before he vanished. Fraud reduced to a legal judgment he had never paid, sitting in a courthouse archive where anyone could read it. The dates lined up perfectly with a gap on Julian's professional resume that I had once accepted without a second thought. On Friday afternoon, I laid the printouts on Arthur Cole's desk and watched my boss read. Arthur has been a small town lawyer for 30 years and is startled by nothing. He took off his reading glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and said, "Clara, if this certificate is authentic, your sister's wedding is a Class C felony with floral arrangements." Then Arthur said the second thing, the practical, legal thing that cost me a week of sleep. Until the certified copies arrive with an official raised seal, you have a story, not proof. And if you voice this in Oak Ridge before you can prove it, his attorney will slap us with a defamation suit by Thursday. He leaned back and looked at me with genuine concern, which somehow made it feel worse. "Clara, think about this town. The jilted ex-fiancé accuses the perfect groom. You would lose in the court of public opinion before you ever stepped into a real one." He wasn't wrong. My mother had spent 14 months casting me in the role of the bitter sister. An accusation without documentation would fit that narrative perfectly. So, I waited for the mail, and at night I lay awake in my apartment doing math on the ceiling. If Audrey was telling the truth. My sister was 3 weeks away from marrying a felon, entering a honeymoon paid for out of Grandma Martha's trust, and merging accounts with a man whose actual wife couldn't afford an attorney. If Audrey was mistaken or lying and I ran with it, I would permanently become the woman who tried to burn down her sister's wedding out of malice. There was no scenario where I got to be both sure and safe at the same time. I want to be completely honest about something. A small, cold voice inside me said, "Let it happen. You warn no one. You owe no one. Let the picture-perfect couple have their picture-perfect fraud." I noted that thought the way I would note a hostile witness. Then, on Saturday morning, I decided to try the gentlest approach first. I texted my sister and asked her to meet for coffee. Just the two of us. It did not go the way I hoped. We met at the Roasted Bean on Main, the coffee shop with the unstable corner table. My sister arrived 20 minutes late in full wedding planning mode, all binder tabs and color-coded highlighters. I hadn't been alone with her since the cabin discovery. She looked genuinely happy, which complicated everything. I kept my tone soft. I asked about the centerpieces, the catering, mom's seating chart. Then I set my cup down and asked the single question I had rehearsed. "Gemma, how much do you actually know about Julian's years in Washington?" Her entire expression shifted. She had been waiting 14 months for me to say something exactly like that. And here I was, right on schedule, the bitter older sister making subtle insinuations. She didn't even ask what I meant by the question. That is the detail that still strikes me. She never asked what I knew. She leaned across the table and said, low and triumphant, It's not stealing if he chose me, Clara." Then she gathered her planning binder like a judge delivering a verdict and added, "Some people just can't stand watching others be happy." She was gone before her drink had even cooled. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. I knew who it was before I looked, because my sister has always had one reflex faster than her smile, reporting back to headquarters. My mother didn't bother with a greeting. "If you try to ruin this wedding, Clara, do not bother showing up at all. Do you understand me?" I understood completely. The sister door was closed. The mother door had never existed. I drove home to Cedar Lane with both hands gripping the wheel and did household chores until midnight, because manual labor is honest work that cannot be spun. Then, near 1 o'clock in the morning, my phone illuminated. A text from Audrey in Spokane. "You sound like you don't fully believe me yet. I understand. Come see for yourself." Bring nothing. I'll show you everything. That Saturday, I told no one where I was going. I put on casual clothes, filled a thermos, and drove 3 hours east into Washington, stopping at a quiet diner in Spokane next door to the hardware store where Audrey worked. She was already waiting in a booth when I arrived. She looked like her voice sounded, once vibrant, but now carries a deep wariness, with faint flour dust on her forearm from her morning shift. In the booth next to her sat a young boy with Julian's exact jawline, coloring a paper placemat. Liam, 7 years old. He was drawing a house with 3 stick figures in front of it. The tallest one, the father figure, had no face. He simply hadn't drawn it yet, probably. I've never been able to convince myself of that, though. Audrey didn't offer a dramatic speech. She reached into a tote bag and slid something across the table. That soft slide of laminated paper on the tabletop is the sound I will remember from this entire experience when everything else has faded. A marriage certificate laminated like a diploma. Julian Michael Fletcher and Audrey Ann Ruse, Spokane County, Washington. 9 years ago, June. Signatures. County seal the official stamps. Then she spoke, and the pattern unfolded like a map. Julian had courted her right when her mother's store was transitioning ownership, right when financial assets were about to be attached to her name. The charm. The quick home repairs, the memorized tea orders. I could have recited the sequence with her. Married in June accounts merged by September, and then completely drained and gone before their son could speak his first words, leaving her with a debt she couldn't pay and a marriage she couldn't afford to legally dissolve. "He doesn't marry women, Clara," Audrey said, stirring a cup of coffee she never drank. "He marries money that has a woman attached to it." I was still holding the certificate when she looked up and added, almost gently, "There is one more thing you should know. It's about that trust fund your grandmother left." Here is what Audrey knew. Secondhand, but highly specific. A mutual contact from Julian's past in Washington, the one associate he still kept in touch with, had heard Julian boast months ago that his new fiancé had, quote, "on inheritance that unlocks the very day we sign the license." That single sentence recontextualized my entire year. Grandma Martha's trust releases immediately upon marriage. The $220,000 transferred to Gemma the day assigned marriage license is filed. Julian hadn't asked those curious tax questions as my fiancé. He had been studying the combination to a safe he planned to open. And when I slid a prenuptial agreement across the table, I changed the lock. So he switched to the sister who signs whatever is placed in front of her. Gemma had already opened a joint account with him for their honeymoon, sharing both their names with no reason for delay after the ceremony. I asked Audrey what she wanted out of this, asking carefully, because I needed to know what I was bringing back to Oak Ridge. She looked down at her son's drawing and kept her voice steady. I want him served with divorce papers at a verifiable address. I want child support. And I want my son to stop asking why his father's new family gets to have him and we don't. That's all, Clara. I'm not looking to cause a scene at a wedding. I'm looking to end a marriage that never actually ended. On the drive back, I stopped for fuel. While the tank filled, I went inside the station and purchased a box of plain manila envelopes. I didn't know yet exactly what would go into one. I only knew deep down who it was meant for. 9 days before the wedding, the official mail arrived. A certified copy of the marriage certificate with a raised seal from Spokane County. The clerk's official letter confirming no divorce was on record. A certified copy of the 45,000 judgment and a notarized affidavit from Audrey, which she had sworn at her credit union on her lunch break, detailing the marriage, the abandonment, and their son. Documents do not lie, and now the documents had official seals. Arthur made 2 phone calls that afternoon with me sitting across from his desk. The first went to the county prosecutor's office. They were interested, Arthur said, but official processes take time, verifying out of state records, coordinating jurisdictions, reviewing potential charges. Send us the complete packet. We'll review it next week. The wedding was Saturday. Next week was another lifetime. The second call went to the local clerk's office, where we learned Julian and Gemma had already been issued their Oregon marriage license days prior. On the application under prior marriages, Julian had sworn none. That is perjury on an official affidavit, a criminal offense sitting in a filing cabinet. But a license, once issued, cannot simply be revoked by a clerk over a phone call from a private law firm. Here is what I want you to understand about that week. I did everything correctly. I uncovered the truth. I verified it. I took it to the authorities. And every single door opened politely only to offer the same response, not before Saturday. The law is a powerful tool, but it is slow. Weddings are fast. Sitting in my car outside the office, I realized there was only one door left that wasn't an institution. It was a workshop on Birchwood Lane, and inside was the man who had taught me how to ride a bicycle. My father has spent his life repairing things, circuit breakers, cabinet doors, the neighbor's irrigation system late at night. I found him in his workshop with the radio playing a week before the wedding, and I handed him the folder without saying a word, because words would have given him an excuse to look away. He read the document standing up under the fluorescent shop light. He read the marriage certificate twice. When he reached the affidavit, specifically the paragraph regarding Liam, his hands began to tremble. I watched my father age in real time under a 60-watt bulb. He believed me. I want that stated clearly. My father looked at certified proof that the man marrying his younger daughter was already another woman's husband and a vanished father. And Richard Vance believed every single page. Then he squared the papers, closed the folder, and pushed it back across the workbench. "Clara," he said, "your mother put her entire savings into this weekend. Gemma would never survive the humiliation, not in this town." Then, even quieter, he added the sentence he needed to hear. Maybe he's changed. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, and the woman in Washington can handle her legal affairs after the weekend. He couldn't even look at me while saying it. I stood in that workshop where I had spent some of the best hours of my childhood, handing him tools. And I understood with absolute clarity. My father wasn't choosing Julian. He was choosing the portrait, same as always, just with far higher stakes. The most painful part of my story isn't the sister who took my fiancé or the mother who took her side. It is the father who believed me and folded anyway. I picked up my folder, kissed his cheek so he would know the relationship wasn't completely severed, and drove back to Cedar Lane. Only one door remained now. It wore a collar on Sundays, and I would have to time it perfectly. People ask why I never confronted Julian directly, why I didn't give him a chance to slip away quietly and spare the family the public display. Here is the simple arithmetic on that. A man who has already abandoned one family does not suddenly repent when cornered. He accelerates. Show Julian my folder on Wednesday, and by Thursday, he has convinced Gemma to drive to a courthouse 2 counties over for a private ceremony. The license was already issued. Any officiant would suffice, and the trust fund would unlock before my certified mail ever arrived, or he empties their shared accounts and disappears entirely, and Audrey loses the address she has waited 5 years to find. Warning him wasn't an act of mercy. It was handing a head start to the fastest runner in the room. So, at the family dinner my mother insisted on hosting, I said almost nothing. I passed the dishes. I discussed the weather with my extended family, and once, just once, when Julian was holding court about their travel plans, I set my fork down and delivered a single, flat sentence across the table. Spokane is beautiful in the spring, isn't it? Julian, his face did that thing again, that 1 second buffer, the portrait stalling. Then the smile reloaded, and he said he'd never really spent any time in Washington. My sister squeezed his arm. My mother refilled his wine glass. After dinner, in the hallway by the coat closet, he found me. He stood close, kept his voice warm for anyone passing by, and said, "Whatever you think, Clara, nobody is listening to you. They stopped listening years ago." Then he smiled and added, "See you Saturday. Sit somewhere the camera can't find you." Even his threats were about the pictures. He had learned the household rules far faster than I ever had. Thursday evening, 2 days before the ceremony, the riverfront estate was illuminated like a gallery. The rehearsal dinner was underway for 60 guests. My mother moved through the venue with a tablet, radiant, fully alive. Directing the layout like a conductor leading the orchestra she'd waited her entire life to stand in front of. I asked her for 10 minutes of her time. I got 4 in the hallway near the service kitchen. I held the folder where she could see it and said, "Mom, before Saturday, you need to read what is in here. It's about Julian. It is certified. It is real." She looked at the folder the way she had once looked at my teenage braces. She didn't reach for it. She smoothed the front of her jacket and delivered the statement she must have been drafting for days. "I have 200 guests arriving. A photographer from Seattle and a drone Clara. Whatever is in that folder, it is 2 days too late and one sister too bitter. You will sit in the back row. You will smile. And you will not ruin the photos." Then she walked back into the dining room and laughed at something a guest said, and I stood by the service door, listening to the hum of the industrial refrigerator, which at least was performing honest work. Something inside me finally broke, and the break was clean. You will not ruin the photos. 22 years after an autumn portrait with 3 people in it. The frame had never once expanded to include me, and it never would. I walked to my car through the warm evening air, sat behind the wheel, and called Watts. Audrey answered on the second ring, wide awake. "Come," I said. "Come Saturday. Bring your certificate." "And bring Liam's birth certificate. I will purchase your travel tickets tonight." A long breath traveled across the phone line. Then she said, "We'll be there." The wedding was 2 days away, and there was no turning back now for either of us. Before we get to that Saturday, tell me something in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and speaking the truth? Because I was about to find out what that choice actually costs. Stay with me. Audrey and Liam arrived on Friday evening, and I drove them to a quiet motel near the highway well outside the reach of anyone in my mother's social circles. Liam fell asleep against his mother's shoulder in my back seat, and Audrey and I sat in the dark parking lot afterward with the vehicle lights off. Two women planning the quietest intervention in the town's history. Because here is what this was not going to be. It was not going to be a scene from a television drama. No standing up mid-ceremony to shout objections, no phones held high, no screaming matches by the gift table. If we did it that way, my mother would have the entire event repackaged by Sunday morning. The bitter sister hired an actress. Poor Gemma, pray for our family. Spectacle was their language, we would not be speaking it. Instead, we would speak mine. I laid out the plan against the steering wheel. Everything went into one single manila envelope, the certified marriage certificate, the clerk's official letter showing no divorce on any docket, the active civil judgment, and Audrey's notarized affidavit with her contact information written at the top in clear blue ink. And that envelope would go to exactly one person, Pastor Graham, the officiant. Not to my parents, who would bury it, not to Gemma, who would hand it straight to Julian. The officiant is the one individual in a wedding with actual legal authority in the moment, the person whose signature validates a marriage license, a minister who holds credible, certified proof that a groom is currently married cannot lawfully sign that document. And Pastor Graham had known our family for decades. He would read every page. Audrey listened, nodded, and then asked the question I had been avoiding for 3 weeks. "You're protecting the sister who took your fiancé," she said. "Why?" I looked out at the parking lot lights for a moment. "I'll let you know on Saturday," I replied. That night at my kitchen table, I wrote a single line on the front of the envelope. "For Pastor Graham, before you sign anything, Saturday arrived hot and clear, a postcard of a summer day. The kind of weather my mother would have claimed credit for. St. Jude's Chapel was adorned with more white hydrangeas than it had seen in years. The Seattle photographer walked the center aisle with 2 cameras. Outside, the drone rose and hovered over the chapel like a silent hawk. I arrived early, alone, wearing dark gray, with my grandmother's silver brooch pinned over my heart and the manila envelope resting flat inside my handbag. At the entrance, an usher checked his seating chart, walked me past rows of people who had known me since childhood, and directed me to the very last row, right next to the sound booth. A small, printed card was placed on the cushion reserved to Vance. My mother had actually printed a card to ensure there was no confusion about where the unphotogenic daughter belonged. 2 rows ahead, one of my relatives turned around and whispered to her neighbor, "Why is the sister seated all the way back there?" The neighbor whispered back, Evelyn's instructions. For the photos, somewhere deep down, a 12-year-old girl in an arm cast sat down beside me. My phone vibrated once. "Audrey, we are in the parking lot. Whenever you're ready, or never, your call. I want you to notice that the plan had an off switch until the very last second, and that switch belonged to me. I could have handed the envelope over quietly after the ceremony, let the attorneys unravel the mess over the following month, let the fraud become official before anyone intervened, or done nothing at all. I texted back the final instruction. Wait in the foyer once the doors close, and watch through the glass. Then I turned my phone face down as the music began and 200 guests turned toward the entrance. My sister was stunning. I have earned the right to say difficult things about Gemma, and I am telling you. She walked down that aisle like a force of nature. Our father walked her down, his face pale and tight in his rented tuxedo. Even from 15 rows back, I could see his jaw working. And I wondered, I still wonder, what it cost him to hand her over to a man whose marriage certificate he had read under a workshop light. My mother stood in the front pew in champagne silk, her chin high. This was her masterpiece, years in the making, finally displayed. And Gemma. Here is what nobody warns you about. Gemma looked genuinely happy. My younger sister, marrying the person she believed was the love of her life. Doubt sat down next to me, right on the reserved card. What if I just let this be? Who appointed me the family's arbiter of truth? The certified documents weren't incorrect. Official seals don't have personal biases. But for one long minute, I questioned every step that had brought me to this pew with this envelope, and my mind mounted a strong defense for silence. Then the wedding party reached the altar. I watched Julian take my sister's hands, and Pastor Graham, silver-haired and solemn, looked out at the congregation before beginning. His eyes moved across the room, row by row, and they paused just for a second on the back row, on me. The man had known our family for 40 years. He knew exactly whose sister was seated by the sound booth, and something in his expression asked a quiet question. Mine had already answered. The ceremony proceeded. Pastor Graham spoke of commitment and honesty. A cousin performed a musical piece. My mother dried her eyes on cue, and the drone drifted past the stained glass windows outside, its quiet motor humming. And then, during the ring exchange, the situation shifted. The best man, Julian's associate, leaned in while passing the rings and murmured something intended to be private. But old chapels are built to carry sound. Every usher learns that, and so did he. Cabin honeymoon, then straight to the bank Monday, right? He breathed. And Julian, my sister's almost husband, standing at the altar, winked. A wink at the altar about the bank. About my grandmother's trust unlocking in a matter of minutes the moment ink hit that license. Whatever remained of my hesitation vanished. I touched Grandma Martha's brooch. Words fade, she had told me documents endure. Certified, sealed, and patient. The truth was sitting 15 rows away from the only person in the building legally required to care what it said. Pastor Graham turned the page in his book. Then he spoke the traditional words. If anyone here can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be joined, let them speak now, or forever hold their peace. 200 people smiled and waited for the brief, customary pause. The moment where nothing ever happens. I opened my handbag. I need to slow down and show you this moment, because this was the point where my entire life sat in my hands. Option 1, stay seated. Let the moment pass. Let them sign the documents. The trust unlocks, and inevitably, Julian does what he has done before. A year from now, the accounts are empty. The cabin is leveraged, my sister is ruined, and my mother's grand wedding becomes the most expensive photograph in the county. And me, I remain blameless. I warned them. I went to my sister, my mother, my father, and every one of them chose the portrait. All I had to do was continue being what this family had raised me to be, the quiet one in the back, out of the frame. The temptation was strong, but sitting there in row 15, I completed the inventory. A 7-year-old child draws his father with a blank face. My grandmother polishes the county seal and tells me documents are the only things that endure. A 12-year-old holds a light reflector so her family can look perfect without her. And I understood all at once that if I remained silent now, I wasn't letting them face their own consequences. I was participating in the illusion. Silence to protect the image. That was the family business, and this was my final performance. The truth wasn't a favor Gemma had earned. It was simply the only real thing I had left. Pastor Graham opened his book to the vows. I stood up. Julian was in the middle of speaking, promising faithfulness, when my pew creaked. 200 heads began turning toward the back of the chapel in a slow, halting wave. The organist looked up. The photographer's shutter stopped clicking. Even the drone outside seemed to hover closer to the glass. I walked 40 steps down the center aisle of St. Jude's Chapel, wearing dark gray and flat shoes, my grandmother's brooch catching the light from the stained glass. I held the manila envelope flat against my side. I was neither fast nor slow. I have filed legal motions with more outward drama than that walk. Somewhere to my left, I heard my mother stand up. Her voice cut through the silence like breaking glass. Clara, Clara, the photos. I felt no anger when she said it. No triumph either. Just the final confirmation that even now, even here, the frame mattered more than what was actually standing inside it. Julian's gaze found me over my sister's shoulder. I watched his rehearsed smile stall, and this time it did not return. Gemma turned last, confused, then angry, then, when she saw the envelope, something much older. I did not look at her for long. I walked directly to Pastor Graham, who stood completely still. His expression was calm and remarkably kind. I held out the envelope with both hands. My voice was low, but in the silence of the chapel, it carried clearly. Pastor, before you sign anything today, you need to read what is in here. I am sorry. It has to be now. Then I stepped back, folded my hands, and waited. Pastor Graham looked at me for a long moment, then opened the envelope. He read the way careful men read, slowly, reviewing the pages twice. He read the marriage certificate with its official raised seal. He read the clerk's verification letter. He unfolded Audrey's notarized statement, and I watched his eyes pause on the paragraph concerning their son. The chapel was completely silent. 200 people, a drone idling outside, and the only sound was the rustle of turning paper. My mother began moving up the side aisle, her host's smile firmly in place, murmuring something about a private family matter and the reception schedule. Pastor Graham did something I have never seen anyone do to her. He raised one hand, and my mother stopped in her tracks. Then he removed his reading glasses, looked directly at the groom, and asked in his gravest tone, "Julian, is any of this correct? Are you, at this moment, a married man?" And here is where Julian Hayes made the mistake that undone him faster than any document could. He laughed. That easy, confident laugh, spreading his hands, and said, "Pastor, come on. That is old Washington paperwork. A previous situation. We were basically separated. It wasn't even a real." He stopped on his own. No one had interrupted him. The atmosphere in the room had simply changed. A collective intake of breath from the congregation. 200 people doing the math on his explanation. My sister's bouquet lowered slowly. Gemma looked at the envelope, then at Julian, and asked in a quiet voice that the microphone captured clearly, "What paperwork from Washington?" Julian. And before he could recover, the double doors at the back of the chapel opened, and the answer to her question walked in, holding the hand of a 7-year-old boy. Audrey did not raise her voice. She stopped a respectful distance down the aisle, and she spoke as calmly as she had on the phone. "I'm not here to cause a scene," she said. "My name is Audrey Fletcher. I have been married to Julian for 9 years." No one moved. Somewhere in the pews, a hymnal slipped to the floor, and nobody reached to pick it up. And then Audrey looked down at her son, and Liam looked at the man in the tuxedo. In the absolute silence of that chapel, a small voice said without any anger, simply identifying a fact, "Hi, Dad. I have witnessed a great deal of conflict in my line of work, repossessions, custody disputes, estate battles. I have never seen anything dismantle a room like that child's greeting. Women I had known my entire life put their hands over their mouths." An entire row of guests turned to face Julian. Julian ran. He dropped my sister's hands and moved quickly toward the side exit by the vestry. And that is when my father, Richard Vance, silent his entire life at every moment that mattered, stepped out of the front pew and blocked the doorway. "Sit down, son," my father said in the voice he used for hazardous situations. "You'll want witnesses for whatever you say next." What broke the room's paralysis was my mother. Her immediate instinct told me everything. She turned toward the balcony, pointing at the photographer, and cried out, "Turn that camera off!" Turn it off. Not a question for the groom, not a gesture toward her daughter. The image came first. Pastor Graham closed his book. "There will be no ceremony today," he said quietly and firmly. "I cannot validate this union, and I will not." He lifted the unsigned marriage license and set it aside, like evidence being entered into a record. My mother, looking for someone to hold responsible for the collapse of her event, found me standing near the altar. "You did this," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "You couldn't stand it. You have never been able to stand it." I let her finish. Then I said the only thing I had walked down that aisle to say, speaking clearly and calmly, "Mom, you sat me where I couldn't ruin the photos, so I saved the family instead." Grandma Martha taught me the difference. She stared at me as if I had spoken a foreign language, and perhaps in her world I had. Behind us, the certified documents had begun traveling hand to hand down the pews, silver-haired guests reviewing the official seals. I watched the community my mother had spent decades managing read the truth for themselves off a piece of certified paper. Julian made one final attempt. He turned to my sister, his hands open. "Gemma, listen, we can resolve this. The trust paperwork is all ready." The trust paperwork. At his own collapsed wedding, with his wife standing in the aisle and his son watching, the man's thoughts went directly to the release of the funds. Spoken aloud into a live microphone, my sister looked at him, really looked at him, for perhaps the first time in 14 months. I watched the structure of her illusion collapse silently. She didn't shout. I will always respect her for that. She pulled the diamond ring off her finger, took his hand and pressed it into his palm, folding his fingers over it. Julian looked around the chapel, at the guests, the flowers, the photographer, the ruined event, and let out a short, cold laugh. "You people," he said, "would rather look happy than be smart. That's why this was easy." Nobody responded. There was nothing left to say. He had just stated our family's unwritten rule aloud. He walked out through the door. My father stepped aside to unblock, and an off-duty deputy in the 5th row followed him out to the parking lot to record his license plate and direction of travel. Monday was coming for Julian, whether he was prepared for it or not. Inside, 200 guests sat in a decorated chapel with no wedding. My sister stood alone at the altar in her white dress, looking around for support. She looked for our mother. Our mother was still speaking to the photographers. I found Gemma 20 minutes later on the floor of the dressing room, surrounded by layers of white silk, her makeup smeared. I brought her a glass of water. She took it with both hands. For a while, neither of us said anything. Two sisters, alone for the first time in over a year. Then Gemma said the truest thing I had ever heard her voice. "He didn't choose me, Clara. He chose the trust fund. You were the only one he couldn't manipulate." She laughed quietly into her glass. "I took him because, for once, something of yours looked good on me. That's what they raised me to do. Look good in things." There it was, the entire system laid open by the person it was built to showcase. My younger sister, taught from childhood that being looked at was the same as being loved. We were manufactured in the same house, just different departments. I sat down next to her on the floor, my dark gray dress beside her white gown, and she put her head on my shoulder and cried. The door opened. My mother stood there, her composure regained, already restructuring the narrative. "We will say the wedding has been postponed," she announced. "An unexpected illness. People respect illness." Then her gaze landed on me. "Clara, it is best you are not in the follow-up portraits. We will explain it as travel plans." And the strangest thing happened, it didn't hurt. For 22 years, that rejection had held weight in my life. And it finally lost its power. "I know. Mom," I said, "I was never going to be." I kissed my sister's head and walked out. Once the dust settled, Julian was charged with perjury for the false statement on the marriage license application. The Washington judgment caught up with him too. His company terminated his employment shortly after, citing professional conduct standards. Audrey's divorce proceedings finally moved forward because the legal papers had a verifiable address to be served to, bringing with it years of back child support calculated by a system with no interest in personal charm. Because no marriage had actually occurred, the trust remained untouched. Grandma Martha's funds remained secure in the account. Gemma closed the joint account the following Tuesday, with Arthur Cole assisting her pro bono and me standing behind her chair. The Mirror Lake cabin remained whole, every cedar plank, every screen. 2 weeks later, Audrey sent me a photograph of Liam smiling outside the local store with a court date circled on a calendar behind him. Her caption was brief: "Filed, served free." My mother, meanwhile, did exactly what she does best. Her social media statement went up that Sunday. "The wedding has been postponed as our family navigates a private matter. We appreciate your support." The local community offered their standard condolences. The image survived. The image always survives. But something in town had changed regardless. Because 200 people had read that certificate with their own eyes. You cannot style your way out of an official seal. 3 weeks after the wedding that wasn't, on a Saturday morning, someone knocked on the cabin door while I was staining the deck rails. I opened it to find my sister standing on the porch holding 2 coffees. No makeup, no phone, no crowd. "You still take it black?" she asked. That was her entire apology, and I decided it was enough to begin with. We spent the afternoon working on the deck, mostly in a comfortable silence our family had never mastered. She told me she had started seeing a counselor in a neighboring city where nobody knows our name. I told her about the county spelling quizzes Grandma used to give me, and we laughed. Around 4 o'clock, my father's truck pulled up the driveway. Richard got out with his toolbox and, without a word about June, repaired the porch step that had been loose since the winter. That is his language. I've decided to be fluent in it. My mother didn't come. She hasn't, and she may not. I've stopped waiting at that window. Some chains you have to break for yourself. Some people have to find their own way out. My mother is still in her home, straightening frames. But late that afternoon, Gemma and I sat on the freshly stained deck with our feet over the water. 2 of Martha Finch's granddaughters, unphotographed, unposted, completely out of the frame. For the first time in my life, nobody was watching us, and I have never felt more seen. If your family only values you inside the frame of a photograph, step out of it, because the people worth keeping will follow you into the ordinary light. And the ones who won't were only ever posing. That is my story. 1 envelope, a reserved seat in the back row, and a little boy who said, "Hi, Dad?" If you've ever been the one who kept the family honest and faced the blame for it anyway, tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one. And be sure to subscribe to their secret stories, because quiet women keep the receipts, and there are plenty of envelopes left to open.